So we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff with this deep dive, huh? The American healthcare system.
Yeah, it's the big one.
You've shared some research with me, articles. It's a bit unsettling. Almost feels like, are we being set up to be sick? Is that a conspiracy theory, or is there something systemically wrong here?
Well, I think that's the question, isn't it? It really gets to the heart of how we view health in this country.
For sure. We're talking about the arguments made by Dr. Jose Antonio Cisneros. He's a physician and a bioengineer, and they make some pretty bold claims.
They do. Their central argument is certainly an attention grabber. They're basically saying that the entire American healthcare system, at almost every level, is structured in a way that incentivizes chronic illness.
Wow. Okay, so not just like bad luck or individual choices. They're saying the system itself is set up to keep us hooked on healthcare.
That's their argument.
I mean, one example that really jumped out at me was their point about the Affordable Care Act. Like, on the surface, it's supposed to help people access healthcare, right?
Right.
But they make this point, and it kind of makes sense the way they explain it, that by putting a cap on insurance company profits, limiting them to 15% of medical costs, it actually creates a kind of a perverse incentive.
Yeah, this is a classic example of how well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences.
So explain that, because at first I was like, how does that work?
Well, think about it. If an insurance company's profit is a percentage of overall spending, they're incentivized to see healthcare costs go up, not down.
So it's better for them if we're sick and spending more on treatments.
That's the gist of it, yeah. They're not saying insurance companies are evil or anything. It's just that the structure of the system encourages this kind of behavior.
So managing chronic conditions, which we know can be incredibly expensive, becomes more profitable than investing in preventative measures that might actually keep people healthy in the first place.
Exactly. It's like constantly patching up a leaky roof instead of investing in a long-term solution.
And it's not just insurance companies, right? They argue that this whole profit-driven model extends to pharmaceutical companies as well.
Absolutely. They point out that a huge chunk of pharmaceutical profits, something like 95%, come from drugs that manage chronic conditions, not cure them.
So conditions like heart disease, diabetes, some types of cancer things that often require lifelong medication, they become this steady stream of income.
Right. And that can create a situation where there's less financial incentive to find cures when managing the symptoms is so lucrative.
It's a bit of a vicious cycle, isn't it? And it's not like this is some fringe theory they've come up with. The Cisneros siblings are drawing on well-established economic principles here.
Yeah, the idea of perverse incentives is a core part of their argument. Basically, they're saying that when you design a system with misaligned incentives, you can end up encouraging behavior that actually undermines the system's intended purpose.
So a system designed to promote health might actually be set up to perpetuate illness, which makes you wonder, where do we fit into all of this? How does this impact us on an individual level?
The Cisneros siblings point to the children's health crisis in America as a really stark example of this.
You're talking about the fact that childhood obesity and chronic illness rates have just skyrocketed since the 1960s. Back then, seeing an overweight child was like this rare thing, and now it's so commonplace.
Exactly. They use that as a clear sign that something is fundamentally wrong.
But they don't just blame individual choices, do they?
They acknowledge that personal responsibility is a factor, of course, but they argue that it's only one piece of the puzzle. They say the environment we live in, the food we have access to, the messages we're bombarded with, all of that plays a huge role, maybe even a bigger role than we realize.
It's like blaming someone for being unfit when their only food options are fast food restaurants. We're all shaped by the world around us. So if it's not just about individual choice, who else is benefiting from this system? I mean, the Cisneros siblings take us through this whole lineup of players, right?
They do. And insurance companies are first up.
Okay, and we've touched on this, like how their profits are tied to overall healthcare spending. But how does that actually play out in the real world? Give us the concrete details.
Well, since their profit margin is capped at 15% of medical costs, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, it means they actually make more money when overall healthcare spending goes up.
So more expensive treatments, more procedures, even if they're not always necessary.
It can incentivize that kind of approach, yes.
So it's more profitable to treat the problem once it becomes a five-alarm fire than to invest in those preventative measures that might have stopped the fire from starting in the first place.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Okay, so that's insurance companies. And then, of course, there are the pharmaceutical companies.
Right. And we've talked about how they profit from chronic illness, right? The majority of their revenue comes from drugs that manage conditions, not cure them.
Right. It's like, in this system, keeping patients reliant on medication is more profitable than finding a cure.
That's the argument, yeah. And it's not just a small amount of their profits, it's a staggering amount. The Cisneros siblings say that something like 95% of pharmaceutical sales come from treating chronic diseases, things that require ongoing management. Heart disease, kidney disease, various types of cancer, autoimmune diseases.
It's a lot to think about.
It really is.
And then they don't let hospitals off the hook either. They argue that hospitals are also part of this system that prioritizes treatment over prevention.
Yeah, they highlight the way hospitals get reimbursed. It's often based on the number of patients they treat and the procedures they perform.
So more patients, more procedures, more money.
That's the basic formula, yeah.
And they actually give an example in the book, right, about surgeon salaries.
Yeah, they talk about how a surgeon's income can be directly tied to the number of surgeries they perform.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But it's important to clarify, they're not saying that doctors are going around intentionally harming patients, are they?
No, not at all. They're very clear about that. Their point is that the system itself creates these incentives, and those incentives can sometimes lead to decisions that prioritize profit over what's truly best for the patient's long-term health.
It's not about blaming individuals. It's about understanding how the system we've created shapes our choices.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've got insurance companies making more money when we're sick, pharmaceutical companies profiting from our chronic illnesses, and hospitals rewarded for treatments, not prevention. It's a pretty bleak picture.
It can feel that way, yeah. But the Cisneros siblings don't leave us completely powerless. One of their big arguments is that we have agency, especially when it comes to the food we eat.
Right. That's where the title of their book comes in. Eat What You Kill suddenly takes on a whole new meaning.
They believe that ultra-processed foods are a major culprit in this whole epidemic of chronic illness.
They actually call these foods instruments of addiction, right? Like they're engineered to hijack our biology, make us crave more, mess with our natural hunger cues. And we all know overeating leads to a whole cascade of health problems.
Exactly. And they draw this really interesting connection to the tobacco industry.
Oh, right. In the 1980s, when smoking rates started to decline.
Tobacco companies, with all their knowledge of addiction and consumer behavior, started buying up major food companies.
No way, like wolves in sheep's clothing.
It's a striking parallel. They were essentially applying their expertise and getting people hooked to a whole new market.
And that's a bit unnerving given the tobacco industry's track record of, shall we say, manipulating public perception and influencing science to serve their interests.
Yeah, there are definitely parallels there.
So we've got these powerful corporations potentially profiting from our declining health. But what about the regulatory agencies like the FDA? I mean, aren't they supposed to be protecting us from this kind of thing?
You'd think so, right? But that's a whole other layer of this.
What do you mean?
The Cisneros siblings don't let the FDA off the hook either. They argue that even the FDA isn't immune to the influence of the industries it's supposed to be regulating.
Wait, are you saying the FDA might be compromised?
They're not saying it's definitely corrupt or anything, but they do point out some pretty concerning facts. For example, a significant portion of the FDA's funding actually comes directly from the pharmaceutical industry.
Seriously? Like, how much are we talking about here?
It depends on the year, but it can be a substantial amount.
Wow. That does raise some eyebrows, doesn't it?
It does make you wonder about potential conflicts of interest.
For sure. And it's not just about the money, right? The Cisneros siblings argue that this influence extends to shaping public perception, influencing research, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. They give the example of The Atlantic, the magazine. It's received funding from the pharmaceutical industry, and they published an article defending a controversial herbicide called glyphosate, even though there's been research suggesting it could be harmful.
So they're saying these industries use their money to control the narrative around these issues.
That's their argument.
It's a lot to process. We've got corporations potentially profiting from our sickness, regulatory agencies tangled up in conflicts of interest, and a constant barrage of information, some of it potentially misleading. It's overwhelming. What are we even supposed to do with all this information?
It's a lot to digest, for sure. But the good news is the Cisneros siblings don't just leave us with a sense of despair. They actually offer some solutions, both on an individual level and on a larger systemic level.
Okay, good. Because at this point, I'm feeling a little powerless. Like, what can we actually do in the face of all of this?
Well, that's what we'll dive into next. They offer some pretty concrete steps we can take to reclaim our health and push for a system that prioritizes well-being over profits.
All right, let's hear it. So we're not completely powerless in this system, huh? What can we actually do to take back some control?
Well, one of the most empowering takeaways from the Cisneros siblings, and it's right there in the title, is their emphasis on food.
Eat what you kill.
Mm.
Okay, but how do we actually put that into practice?
They're huge proponents of cutting back on ultra-processed foods. They argue that shifting to a diet that's primarily whole, unprocessed foods can have a huge impact on our health.
So ditching the chips and soda, loading up on fruits and veggies, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Prioritizing nutrient-dense foods that come from nature, not a factory. Think fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, seeds, things that haven't been engineered in a lab.
It's like going back to basics, right? The kind of foods humans ate for centuries before processed foods took over.
Exactly. They provide the nutrients our bodies need without all the added junk.
The sugar, unhealthy fats, artificial ingredients, all the stuff that can mess with our biology.
They argue it's about reclaiming our food culture.
Making conscious choices at the grocery store, cooking more meals at home, really thinking about where our food comes from. It's a lot, though, to be honest.
It's a shift for sure. It's not about being perfect, but about making gradual changes. And it ties into their whole concept of metabolic health.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about because I hear that term a lot these days, metabolic health, but I'm not sure I fully understand what it means.
Right, it's become a bit of a buzzword, but for the Cisneros siblings, it's a key part of the equation. It's about optimizing how our bodies process energy.
So how our cells function, how our hormones are balanced, is that what you're saying?
Exactly. It's about creating this internal environment where our bodies can function at their best.
Okay, so it's bigger than just weight loss.
Yes, much bigger.
Yeah.
It's about overall well-being. And they argue that many chronic illnesses, things like heart disease, diabetes, even some types of cancer, can be linked back to problems with metabolic function.
So help me understand that connection. How does metabolic dysfunction lead to chronic illness?
Imagine your metabolism like an orchestra, right? When all the instruments are in sync, the music flows. But if one instrument is out of tune,
The whole thing falls apart.
right. And the Cisneros siblings argue that ultra-processed foods are a major culprit in throwing our metabolic orchestra out of whack.
Because they're full of sugar, refined grains, unhealthy fats, all that stuff that messes with our blood sugar, our hormones.
Exactly. It creates this cascade of dysfunction. They even call it a toxic stew.
Toxic stew, that's a pretty strong image.
They're not just talking about food either. They include things like environmental toxins in that stew.
Pesticides, air pollution, even mold, that kind of thing?
Right. Things that can disrupt our hormones, our immune systems.
Wow. So it's not just what we're putting into our bodies, it's also what's in the air we breathe, the water we drink.
It's our environment.
But isn't it difficult to prove a direct link between these environmental toxins and specific illnesses? I mean, there's so many factors involved.
You're right, it's complicated. But the Cisneros siblings argue that we shouldn't dismiss these concerns just because the science isn't 100% settled. They believe in erring on the side of caution.
So precautionary approach, better safe than sorry.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got ultra-processed foods, environmental toxins, and this healthcare system that isn't exactly set up to address these root causes. It's a lot. Where do we even begin to tackle this?
The Cisneros siblings have this two-pronged approach, taking control of our own health through our daily choices and advocating for larger system-wide change.
Individual action and systemic change.
That's it. They believe both are essential.
All right, so let's start with what we can do as individuals. You've convinced me on ditching the processed food and focusing on nutrient-dense stuff. But what about all those environmental factors? It's not like I can just snap my fingers and make the air cleaner, right?
Of course not. But you can control your immediate environment to some extent.
Okay, so things like choosing natural cleaning products, filtering my water, even being mindful of the personal care products I use.
Exactly. Those small changes can add up over time.
It's about reducing our exposure wherever possible.
Right.
What about stress? I mean, let's face it, we live in a pretty stressful world these days.
Stress is a huge factor. The Cisneros siblings talk about finding healthy ways to manage stress.
Exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, strong social connections, all that good stuff.
Exactly. It's all connected mind, body, and environment.
It makes sense, but it also highlights just how much of our health is determined by factors that are often outside of what we traditionally think of as healthcare.
That's the point they're making. We need a more holistic view of health.
So individual action is important, but it's not enough on its own. What about these systemic changes they're calling for? What would it take to actually shift the healthcare system toward this more preventative health-focused approach?
They have a few ideas. One big one is reducing the influence of special interest groups.
The pharmaceutical industry, the processed food industry, all the big players we've been talking about.
Right. They argue that these industries have too much sway over healthcare policy and research.
We talked about that with the FDA, right? Those potential conflicts of interest.
Exactly. They believe we need more transparency.
So shining a light on those lobbying efforts, those backroom deals, making sure that decisions are being made based on public health, not corporate profits.
Yes.
It's about making healthcare, about, well, healthcare again.
That's the goal. They want to see a system that prioritizes prevention, early intervention, addresses the root causes of illness.
Instead of just putting Band-Aids on problems after they've already blown up. You know, there's that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It seems like common sense, but it feels like our system is structured in exactly the opposite way.
They would agree with you there. They're advocating for a complete paradigm shift in how we think about and approach health.
This has been heavy stuff, eye-opening for sure. We've gone deep into this. The Cisneros siblings, their book, they argue that our healthcare system is more about managing illness than truly promoting health.
They make a strong case. And it definitely makes you think about how we view health, what we prioritize, you know?
They paint this kind of depressing picture at first, like this system that often seems to be working against us instead of for us.
Yeah, it can feel that way, right?
But they do offer some hope, thankfully.
Absolutely.
It's not all doom and gloom.
Right. They believe we're not powerless. We can make a difference.
Both through our own choices and by advocating for larger changes. Okay, but how?
So they talk about this shift in mindset. Like, we need to move away from this idea of just managing diseases after they pop up and really focus on creating health.
Proactive instead of reactive.
Exactly.
Okay, so we could wave a magic wand, redesign the whole system. What would a healthcare system that's truly designed to create health look like?
That's the million-dollar question. There's no simple answer, obviously. But the Cisneros siblings give us a framework, a place to start. Like, they keep coming back to this idea of metabolic health being the foundation.
Remind me what that means again. Metabolic health. And why it's so central to their argument.
Sure. So metabolic health is basically how well our bodies process energy. It's about making sure our cells are working right, hormones balanced, the whole system humming along smoothly.
So not just about weight.
Nope, it's bigger than that. It's about creating the right internal environment for our bodies to thrive. And they argue that so many chronic illnesses, heart disease, diabetes, certain cancers, they can be traced back to some kind of metabolic dysfunction.
Wow. So to prevent those illnesses, we need to focus on getting our metabolic health in check.
That's the idea. And they propose we need to shift to a preventative approach, one that focuses on creating the conditions for good metabolic health rather than just trying to manage diseases after they develop.
Which brings us back to that two-pronged approach we were talking about, individual action and systemic change. So what are some concrete things we can do in our own lives starting today to support our metabolic health?
Well, diet is huge, right? Like we've discussed. Cutting back on those ultra-processed foods and embracing whole, nutrient-dense options is crucial.
Fruits, veggies, legumes, healthy fats. Those are our friends.
Those are the all-stars. They provide the good stuff our bodies need. And they don't come with all those added sugars and artificial ingredients that can mess with our metabolism.
What about all those environmental toxins we talked about? The pesticides, the air pollution. We can't exactly live in a bubble.
True. But you can still reduce your exposure. Start by making your home environment as healthy as possible. Choose natural cleaning products. Filter your water. Be mindful of the personal care products you use. Every little bit helps.
Okay, so it's about being aware of those hidden toxins and taking steps to minimize our exposure where we can. What about stress?
Stress management is massive. Chronic stress can really throw our bodies out of whack, metabolically speaking.
Exercise, meditation, nature, good friends, those are all important.
They can make a big difference.
So much of this is about recognizing the interconnectedness of things. Our minds, our bodies, our environment.
Right, it's all one system.
Okay, but let's talk about those big picture systemic changes. What needs to happen to shift the entire healthcare system toward a more preventative, health-focused approach? What would that even look like?
Well, for starters, the Cisneros siblings argue that we have to tackle the influence of those big special interest groups, the ones who benefit from the status quo.
The pharmaceutical industry, the processed food industry, we're back to them again.
They wield a lot of power, and they're not always incentivized to support changes that could hurt their bottom line.
So how do we fight that?
Transparency is a good place to start. shining a light on how those industries influence healthcare policy, exposing those lobbying efforts, the funding of biased research. We need to demand that public health, not corporate profits, drives decision-making.
It's about taking back our health, right? Making it clear that healthcare should be about, well, caring for people's health.
Exactly. And that might mean fundamentally changing how we pay for healthcare, moving away from this fee-for-service model that rewards treatment over prevention.
Yeah, it seems crazy that right now it's more profitable to treat someone after they're sick than it is to prevent them from getting sick in the first place.
Exactly. So we need to create incentives for prevention, for early intervention. We need to make it easier for people to access healthy food, affordable housing, safe places to exercise, all those factors that contribute to health.
It's about recognizing that everyone deserves to be healthy, not just those who can afford it.
That's the goal.
The Cisneros siblings, they present this big vision, don't they, for a future where health is the default, not the exception.
They do, and they argue that we have the power to make that vision a reality.
It starts with us. Our choices, our voices, our willingness to demand better.
And it's about supporting those who are already working to create this change. The doctors, the researchers, the activists, the policymakers who are fighting for a healthier future for everyone.
Well, I don't know about you, but I feel both challenged and inspired by all of this.
Me too.
This deep dive, it's been a journey.
For sure.
It can feel overwhelming at times, but ultimately I think it's a message of hope.
It is.
We're not powerless. We have more agency than we realize.
Absolutely.
We can make choices to support our own health and well-being.
Right now.
We can speak up, raise our voices, and demand a better system.
A system that works for everyone.
This is where the real work begins.
It does.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
We hope this has sparked something in you, a desire to learn more, to make changes, to get involved in creating a healthier future for us all.
You're here.
Here's to a healthier tomorrow.
Cheers to that.